Welcome to the law offices of Chris M. Ingram's Immigration News Roundup. We hope you enjoy our show. We would like to thank attorney Chris M. Ingram and staff at the law offices of Chris M. Ingram for their hard work in preparing the research for this podcast, which draws on a wide variety of news sources from both sides of the aisle, providing a balanced view. Attorney Ingram is also a vocal advocate for the rights and protection of immigration applicants, although our coverage is designed to be nonpartisan. Please don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to our channel. We are also on Spotify, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook X, Reddit, and Instagram, where we're growing rapidly thanks to our social media team. You can also visit our website on www.breakthroughUSA.com. We'd love to see you there. Okay, let's dive in. So today we are launching a deep dive into, well, what feels like a really high-stakes, deeply contradictory landscape in U.S. immigration policy right now. The last month, it's just been defined by this extraordinary tension, hasn't it? It feels like a collision between this aggressive top-down enforcement push and then the bottom-up, just undeniable demands of the U.S. economy for labor.
It really is the essential paradox of modern America, isn't it? I mean, on one hand, you look at the economy, it's resilient. We're seeing, about 2.1% GDP growth, which is, pretty solid performance globally.
Right, solid.
But that performance is kind of running headlong into this critical limiting factor, these labor shortages. We're talking about 1.8 million unfilled jobs across the country.
1.8 million. And it's not just, flipping burgers either. Our research shows these gaps are hitting really crucial sectors. Think manufacturing, advanced tech, engineering.
Yeah, exactly.
Places where, historically, immigrants already make up nearly 20% of the entire workforce. These aren't just empty chairs. They're like actual gaps in productivity.
That's exactly right. And the macro context here, it's that these labor shortages aren't just some annoyance. They are, you could argue, a direct threat to our economic momentum.
A threat? How so?
Well, if they keep going unchecked, our researchers project they could functionally shave maybe 0.3% off our total GDP growth. So you have an economy that just mathematically desperately needs labor-skilled, unskilled, often immigrant labor just to keep its current pace.
Yet the political reality just feels defined by this atmosphere of crisis. We're dealing with a nation that seems deeply fatigued, polarized. According to recent Gallup polls, something like 55% of Americans see the current immigration situation as a crisis demanding immediate aggressive action, enforcement.
But here's the really fascinating twist that our legal research dug up. In those same surveys, nearly 60% of Americans also strongly support pathways for skilled workers, for merit-based immigration.
Wow, so not just shut the door.
No, it's not a nation demanding a total shutdown. It seems more like a nation looking for, a nuanced, maybe a balanced solution, something that acknowledges the security concerns and the economic needs.
And that is precisely the tightrope we're walking today. Our attorney's analysis of just the last month's events, it highlights 4 central, really high-stakes stories that I think perfectly capture this struggle, this clash between the iron fist of enforcement and maybe the forge of economic necessity.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. First, we have this really inspiring success story, Mahara Zapata, the Salsa Queen of Utah. It's a narrative of hope, definitely, but also legal resilience and huge entrepreneurial contribution.
Okay, the positive side.
Then, shifting gears pretty dramatically to the enforcement side, this massive, almost industrial-scale enforcement milestone, the announcement of over 2 million removals and self-deportations just since the start of the year, a figure with enormous implications.
Okay.
And finally, we're going to look at 2 critical flashpoints that really demonstrate this enforcement friction in action. First, the Supreme Court's judicial shift lifting certain enforcement curbs down in Los Angeles, allowing these broader reasonable suspicion patrols. And second, the highly disruptive, immediate economic fallout from that ICE raid at a critical Hyundai battery plant down in Georgia.
Okay, let's definitely unpack all of this. But I think we need to start with that story of hope. Because, in all the political noise and these huge enforcement numbers, it's just far too easy to lose sight of the profound individual contributions that immigration, when it actually works, makes to the fabric of American life. So let's talk about Mahara Zapata, the founder of Salsa Queen.
Her journey, it really is a case study in resilience, and economic integration. It sort of demonstrates what economists like Giovanni Perry talk about, these deep fundamental forces that really drive long-term economic change in America.
And her start was anything but easy, right?
Yeah.
She came from Monterrey, Mexico, way back in 1989. She's just 17.
Yeah.
entered on a visitor visa, which she and her family then overstayed. So instantly, she's in the shadows, undocumented, had to navigate life in Utah, didn't speak English fluently, hadn't finished high school.
And our legal team really emphasizes the raw, almost visceral details of her early hardship. She talked very candidly about growing up in just crushing poverty. Her family worked midnight janitorial shifts, often at grocery stores like Smith's, ironically.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they subsisted, she said, at times entirely on expired food. She actually recounted having to haul home bruised vegetables, expired dairy, and the grueling task of cutting off the green part of the bruised stuff just to feed the family.
Just cutting off the bad parts.
Yeah. She said because of that upbringing, she grew up feeling, quote, worth nothing.
That is just such a brutally powerful contrast, isn't it? Going from literally cutting the green part off expired food to eventually supplying one of the biggest grocery chains in the region.
Incredible.
The real turning point, she says, was deeply personal, but also incredibly simple. She met Jim Birch. He later became her husband, a U.S. citizen, and her business partner. She recalled him asking her just simply, "What would you like to do?" And she said it was the first time anyone in her life had ever asked her that question. Especially given, what sounds like a very difficult, even abusive upbringing before that.
And thankfully, for all of us who enjoy a good salsa, her answer was pretty definitive. I want to make salsas.
Love it.
Yeah.
And from that simple desire, this empire was born. I mean, she started in the most basic way imaginable, right? Bootstrapping the business entirely through, Facebook sales.
Right.
And making handoffs in parking lots. Her debut at the Wheeler Farmers Market sounds iconic. Sold out 100 jars, just like that, in 2 hours. Made $500.
Wow.
She described that as a proud, humble moment. Just the realization that she could genuinely build something, make a living from her own passion, her own hard work.
Now, this is where we kind of transition into the, let's say, the technical legal analysis, because her path to getting her status resolved is such a crucial point for anyone trying to understand how immigration law actually works on the ground. She eventually resolved her status by marrying Jim, her U.S. citizen husband, back in 2016.
Okay, marriage to a citizen. But what was the key legal detail that made her path successful? Because we know so many others face huge hurdles, even with marriage.
Right. The crucial distinction, and attorney Chris Ingram and our team really highlighted this, is that she had a legal entry. Remember, she came in on that visitor visa. Even though she later overstayed it, that initial legal entry is everything.
Everything.
Well, legally speaking, pretty much. It made her eligible to adjust her status, basically. Apply for her green card from within the United States under Section 245 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And that is an absolute game changer in U.S. immigration law.
Okay, explain that. Why is that specific legal detail, that initial entry, so vital for people listening to understand?
Because it allowed her to avoid the much, much tougher legal path faced by individuals who have what's called an entry without inspection, or EWI.
EWI, meaning they cross the border without papers.
Exactly. For someone who entered EWI, adjustment of status inside the U.S. is generally impossible, even if they marry a citizen. They often have to leave the country to process their green card application at a U.S. consulate abroad.
And leaving triggers other problems, right?
Huge problems. Leaving the U.S. after being unlawfully present for a certain amount of time can trigger mandatory 3-year or even 10-year bars to reentry. So they leave, get barred, and then need these complex, expensive waivers approved just to come back. Zapata avoided that entire legal minefield simply because she had that initial, technically legal visitor visa entry stamp in her passport.
Okay, that's crystal clear. And importantly, she didn't qualify for things like DACA, right? She was too old when she arrived.
Correct. She arrived past the childhood cutoff date for DACA eligibility. So her resolution wasn't through some special program. It was a purely statutory, earned pathway based on existing law that ultimately led to her naturalization, becoming a U.S. citizen in 2019. It was definitely hard won, took years, but it was legally solid.
And the economic significance of her journey. I mean, from cleaning grocery store floors to supplying those same grocery stores.
Yeah.
It's just staggering.
It really is. By 2024, her salsas, you probably recognize the Sugar Skull logo, which honors her child lost tragically to leukemia. They were on the shelves of massive chains like Costco, Harmon's, and Smith's, the very stores her family used to clean.
That's powerful. And she's not some, outlier unicorn story either, is she? Our studies show immigrant entrepreneurs like her contribute. What was the figure?
A staggering $1.3 trillion to the U.S. GDP. annually.
Trillion.
Trillion. And just looking at wealth generation, 13% of all U.S. millionaires are immigrants. So this narrative of immigrants being a drain, the data just doesn't support it. It's actually a massive, often hidden economic engine.
Attorney Chris Ingram's perspective here seems really clear then.
It is.
USCIS is cracking down on visa fraud, and even approved cases are being revoked.
Why was my visa denied? USCIS revoked my approval. At the law offices of Chris M. Ingram, we handle every detail with care. Every form, every fact, every time.
So join us for a free consultation. We do things the right way. Let us take care of you.
His take is that her story is the proof point. It absolutely underscores why we need humane, functional pathways that fuel economic vitality. When the legal system actually provides a route, the results can be massive job creation, innovation, wealth generation for the entire country.
It's incredibly inspiring. But it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many potential salsa queens are out there stuck, maybe facing those EWI challenges we talked about, or just caught in the growing net of enforcement.
Exactly.
Which brings us kind of inevitably, and maybe unfortunately, to the flip side of this story. The truly unprecedented scale of enforcement that was announced just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, we have to shift gears now and talk about the sheer scale of this enforcement surge. It's a dramatic story, and it certainly dominated the national political conversation.
So the Department of Homeland Security announced this back on September 23rd, 2025. A huge milestone. Over 2 million removals and self-deportations achieved in less than 250 days since January 20th.
Right. And we need to break down those numbers carefully for you listening. That 2 million figure, it's comprised of two really distinct parts. First, there are the 400,000 formal enforced removals. These are people arrested, detained, processed through the system, and then forcibly deported by the government.
Okay, 400,000 forced removals.
Correct. But second, and this is a huge number, is 1.6 million documented self-deportations. These are individuals who, likely facing new restrictive policies or increased enforcement fear, have voluntarily chosen to leave the U.S. and their departure was somehow recorded.
Wow, 1.6 million self-deportations. That's massive.
It is. And this aggressive pace overall puts the current administration on track for potentially 600,000 formal deportations by the end of this year alone.
So what are the mechanics behind achieving this pace? Our legal research described them as highly aggressive, highly centralized.
Absolutely. The administration seems to be leveraging the framework from that legislation passed earlier, often referred to as the One Big Beautiful Bill, which provided enormous funding and, importantly, statutory authority for this kind of enforcement expansion.
Right.
This includes the really widespread use of over 1,000 of these 287G agreements. They're now operational in, I think, 40 states.
Okay, hold on. For listeners who might not know, can you quickly define what a 287G pact actually is and why having 1,000 of them is such a big deal?
Sure. So a 287G agreement, basically, it allows state and local law enforcement agencies, often it's county sheriff's departments, to perform the duties of federal immigration officers.
So local cops acting as ICE agents.
Essentially, yes. They get specific training and are then deputized to question individuals about their immigration status during routine encounters, like traffic stops, and they can initiate the detention process for ICE. Leveraging 1,000 of these pacts fundamentally transforms local policing dynamics across huge parts of the country. It turns local sheriffs into, well, de facto immigration enforcement arms, dramatically expanding the reach of federal enforcement without actually having to hire thousands of new federal officers.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like multiplying the federal force. And the research also mentioned these new facilities, something described almost ominously as alligator Alcatraz.
Yeah, that phrase. It was used informally in some of the internal policy discussions our team reviewed. It seems to refer to newly constructed or maybe rapidly repurposed high-security detention centers, often in pretty remote locations. They seem designed for rapid processing and, frankly, deterrence. The overall strategic goal seems pretty simple, as one assistant secretary apparently stated, self-deport or we will arrest and deport you. This is enforcement explicitly structured as a tool of deterrence. Make life difficult enough, scary enough that people leave on their own.
Wow. Okay, so this really intense enforcement focus, it leads directly into this sharp political and economic divide, doesn't it?
Right.
Proponents look at these numbers, the 2 million milestone, and they see it as a resounding success.
They absolutely do. We saw prominent figures like Republican Senator Ted Cruz and media commentators like Laura Ingram framing this clearly as policies working. Their core argument is twofold. One, by removing, quote, criminal illegal aliens, the rule of law is being restored. And two, critically, jobs are being freed up for American citizens.
The jobs argument.
Right. Senator Cruz cited specific data claiming these removals led to a 2% wage boost in certain key sectors, and he correlated it with figures showing 100% of job gains since the inauguration going to citizens. Laura Ingram, citing some polling, claimed a remarkable 70% public approval for this kind of hardline strategy.
Okay, so the economic benefit argument from that side is clear.
Yeah.
Enforcement creates jobs, raises wages for citizens. But then you have the macroeconomists looking at the bigger picture, and they seem to be sounding a very loud, very different kind of alarm.
They really are. The consensus coming out of institutions like the Dallas Fed, the Wharton School at UPenn, it's deeply concerning from their perspective. They're warning that deportation at this kind of scale they project it will trim net migration by about 2.4 million people. Through 2028 is already starting to act as a significant drag on GDP growth. They estimate it's erasing about 0.2% of growth potential right now.
0.2%. I mean, that sounds like a small number in isolation. How does that actually translate into real-world impact for, say, the average consumer or worker?
Well, that 0.2% loss, it's calculated because the labor voids are widening in these critical, often hard-to-fill positions. We're talking auto manufacturing, construction, and especially farm labor.
Right.
This leads to supply chain problems, inefficiencies, and ultimately inflationary pressure on things like food prices. But the long-term projections our researchers found are even scarier.
Scarier how? Tell us about the fiscal cost. Our research cited a pretty astronomical figure there.
Yeah, based on Wharton's economic simulations, the fiscal cost, just the government spending required to execute this level of mass enforcement and removal, is pegged at around $900 billion over the next 10 years.
$900 billion.
Billion. With a B. And this isn't just theoretical. This includes the operational costs, paying for all the expanded ICE and CBT personnel, building and maintaining these new detention facilities like those Alligator Alcatraz sites, plus the legal costs of processing potentially 600,000 deportations annually through the already strained immigration court system, and then the actual costs of physically repatriating people.
So that $900 billion is taxpayer money spent specifically to remove people. Money that presumably could be spent on other things.
Exactly. And the economic consequence of that spending, combined with the loss of labor and consumer spending from the removed population, is projected by Wharton to cause a massive 1.5% dip in overall U.S. GDP by 2034.
1.5% reduction in GDP. That's huge.
It is an enormous bite out of our future national wealth. For you listening, that likely translates into lower overall investment, fewer new businesses starting up, reduced real wage growth across the board, with the Sun Belt region, which is often most economically reliant on these types of jobs, probably being hit the hardest.
Okay, wait a second. How do we reconcile these two pictures? You have Senator Cruz talking about a 2% wage boost in some sectors because of removals. Then you have Wharton predicting a $900 billion cost and a 1.5% drop in GDP. Are they measuring different things? How can both be argued?
That really is the central economic debate here. Proponents of enforcement often focus on, let's call them, short-term, micro-level sectoral wage shifts. The argument is, if you remove a pool of low-wage workers in a specific industry, like maybe construction or agriculture, you create temporary scarcity in that niche, which might push wages up slightly for the remaining citizen workers in that specific spot.
Okay, localized effect.
Right. But the macro analysis from places like the Dallas Fed or Wharton, they're capturing the long-term systemic effects. The loss of overall productivity across the economy, the reduction in tax revenue from those removed, the loss of their consumer spending, the dampening of entrepreneurial activity that immigrants often bring. The macroeconomists tend to see that $900 billion fiscal cost as a definite expenditure, a drag on the budget, while viewing the claimed 2% wage boost as often transitory, highly localized, or potentially offset by price increases anyway. Their models generally conclude that the overall economic cost of systemic disruption far outweighs the potential benefit of very selective small wage gains.
So our legal team, led by attorney Chris Ingram, they offer a perspective that tries to kind of bridge this gap. Or we acknowledge both sides.
Yeah, the analysis from Chris and his team tries to find that balance, it's clear. While enforcement certainly has a grounding in law, laws exist and need to be enforced, the human cost of ripping apart families who've integrated, built lives, maybe started businesses here, that demands a fundamentally compassionate approach.
Compassion isn't always part of the policy calculation, though.
No, but Chris underscores that pro-immigration pathways, like the one that allowed Mahara Zapata to build her Salsa Queen empire, they aren't just optional nice-to-haves. They are vital. Because these individuals fill essential roles, they contribute massively to our economy, they pay billions in taxes annually. The policy focus, he argues, really must shift toward reforms that prioritize dignity and economic contribution over just blanket removals, which actively undermine community stability and, as we just discussed, can be incredibly costly.
So what does this massive shift in enforcement actually mean for families, for communities on the ground, day to day? It seems to mean immediate legal and physical changes in how law enforcement operates, which brings us to that first major piece of enforcement friction you mentioned, the significant judicial shift at the Supreme Court about profiling in LA.
Right. This was a really landmark moment, legally speaking. On September 8th, 2025, the Supreme Court issued a 6-3 stay in this pivotal case, Noam v. Vasquez Perdomo.
And the practical effect of that ruling was what exactly?
The immediate effect was to lift a U.S. district judge's temporary injunction, basically, a court order that had placed some pretty severe limits on how ICE could conduct immigration stops, specifically in Los Angeles. Critically, the Supreme Court's decision now allows federal officers there to use reasonable suspicion based on the totality of circumstances again.
Totality of circumstances. That sounds broad. What does it include?
Well, that's the key. The ruling suggests that totality can once again include factors like, the specific area where the stop occurs maybe near a known pickup spot for day laborers, and potentially even implicitly things like a person's accent, their appearance, or their manner of dress, especially when ICE is conducting specific operations targeting known criminal elements or fugitives.
Okay.
Rome, 20,000 spectators, one epic battle. 2 warriors, 1 destiny. But before they can fight for glory, they must face the real challenge, getting their visa approved.
If you want to enter, show me your visa.
They should have went to the law offices of Chris M. Ingram. They are very good.
Yes, I've heard the same. They handled my visa in no time.
To the lion's pit.
Come with me, boys. It's dinner time.
Because even legends need the offices of Chris M. Ingram.
Are you looking for a visa? Why don't you get your free consultation on the Breakthrough website? We're with you every step of the way.
And the legal backdrop here was a lower court judge trying to prevent exactly that.
Precisely. The initial injunction, issued by Judge Mamam Iwusi Mensah Frimpong, had been highly restrictive. She had specifically barred ICE from using factors like race, speaking Spanish, or even just being near day labor spots as contributing factors to form that reasonable suspicion needed for a stop. SCOTUS, however, sided with the government's enforcement argument. They stated that Judge Frimpong's restrictions imposed, quote, a straitjacket on law enforcement's ability to identify and detain non-citizens who might be violating immigration laws.
So this immediately kicked off a huge constitutional debate, right? Centered on the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures.
Oh, absolutely. The dissent, written powerfully by Justice Sonia Sotomayor and joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, was really stark. Sotomayor warned that by allowing such broad discretion under this totality of circumstances umbrella, the ruling risked creating a country where the government is essentially empowered to seize anyone who, quote, looks Latino, speaks Spanish, and appears to work a low-wage job.
Wow.
Her argument was deeply rooted in the principle that this risks violating every individual's constitutional right to be free from arbitrary government interference, especially given the documented history of racial profiling in immigration enforcement contests.
Yet, Justice Kavanaugh, writing for the majority or concurring, He focused the argument almost entirely elsewhere, didn't he? On the separation of powers, pushing back against the lower court.
Exactly. Kavanaugh's stance was very much non-interventionist regarding policy specifics. He stated clearly that the judiciary does not and should not set immigration policy or dictate enforcement priorities. He basically argued that while individual judges might personally disagree with the executive branch's strategy, maybe they think it's too strict, maybe too lenient judges are simply not appointed to make those specific policy calls. The majority agreed, essentially reaffirming the executive branch's broad authority to decide how federal immigration law is enforced on the ground.
Okay. So shifting from the constitutional debate to the economic one, our researchers highlighted the severe risk that enabling these broader patrols creates, especially in dense, economically vital urban zones like Los Angeles.
Yeah, this is a direct potential economic cost, and it's tied mostly to fear and withdrawal within immigrant communities. Economists who study this project that rulings enabling broader, less restricted enforcement patrols risk causing a measurable drop, maybe around 10% in the Latino workforce, specifically within those affected enforcement zones.
10% drop in workforce participation.
Potentially, in those specific zones. When you consider that LA's annual GDP is hovering around $1 trillion, even a seemingly small attrition rate of productive workers, maybe people leaving the area or just staying home out of fear, could cost the regional economy something like 1.2% of its GDP annually. That's through idle jobs, lost productivity, reduced consumer spending. People withdraw from public life. They stop seeking necessary services. They might even leave the city altogether. It causes a real, tangible economic contraction.
Attorney Chris Ingram emphasized that while the ruling may be affirmed certain constitutional bounds for enforcement, the sheer breadth of discretion it grants, it risks enabling what he called inhumane profiling, something that tears at the very fabric of diverse communities.
Right. His perspective seems to be that while, yes, officers must be allowed to enforce the law, the policies themselves need built-in safeguards. Safeguards to prevent arbitrary stops that disrupt lives, erode community trust, the very trust that's essential for both public safety cooperation and economic engagement. The challenge with this SCOTUS ruling is the lack of clear lines. Where does legitimate, reasonable suspicion end and unconstitutional ethnic profiling begin? This ruling arguably pushed that line further into ambiguity, generally benefiting enforcement priorities over individual civil liberties concerns.
And speaking of economic clashes caused by enforcement, let's turn to that second piece of friction you mentioned, the really stunning ICE raid at the Hyundai plant in Georgia. That caused immediate diplomatic issues and serious questions about whether the policy actually makes sense economically.
Yeah, this incident back on September 4th at Hyundai's big new battery plant down in Bell, Georgia. It was highly visible, widely reported, and it perfectly illustrates this collision between the administration's America First enforcement mandates and the incredibly intricate global realities of modern manufacturing, especially high-tech stuff like EV batteries.
And the operation itself, it involved federal agents detaining a really substantial number of the workforce there, right? Something like 475 workers?
That's the number reported, yes, 475 workers detained. And critically, many of them were not, the typical profile of someone apprehended for illegal border crossing. Many were South Koreans who were actually in status, holding specialist visas.
Specialist visas, like what?
Primarily H-1B visas, which are for specialty occupations requiring theoretical or technical expertise, and L-1 visas, used for intra-company transferees, managers, or employees with specialized knowledge being moved within a multinational company. These workers were brought over specifically because they possessed proprietary electric vehicle technology knowledge that Hyundai needed to transfer to the U.S. facility to get it up and running. Their specialized skills were deemed necessary to kickstart this massive domestic U.S. EV supply chain project.
And the fallout was pretty much instant, wasn't it? This raid immediately delayed this huge, $7.6 billion project, a project central to U.S. efforts to onshore EV battery production.
It's exactly, huge delay. And it caused a really severe diplomatic reaction from Seoul, South Korea. The optics, the spectacle of highly skilled engineers being rounded up, it was disastrous for international relations. Although the administration initially tried to slow walk some of the returns, supposedly for U.S. training purposes, within a pretty short period, 314 of those specialized workers were repatriated back to Korea. Another 161 remained in legal limbo for a while. The viral footage of the detention process just fueled outrage over the heavy-handed tactics used on these highly skilled, legally present workers.
This must have put the Republican governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, who, politically supports the administration's overall enforcement mandate, in a complete bind, right? Because of the economic reality in his state.
Oh, absolutely. Governor Kemp stated publicly that he was completely blindsided by this federal operation. He argued quite vehemently that these kinds of high-profile raids risk jeopardizing potentially $50 billion in planned foreign direct investments coming into Georgia, and that they directly hurt established American job creation efforts already underway. He publicly demanded much better coordination between the federal enforcement arm and state and local economic development interests, basically highlighting how federal priorities were actively damaging his state's economy.
So what are the broader economic consequences when enforcement targets skilled migration like this?
Well, the ripple effect is pretty clear, according to economists our team consulted. These kinds of skilled worker raids, especially when you pair them with earlier policy changes like significant H-1B application fee hikes, they actively trim necessary legal migration of skilled talent. This leads to estimates of potentially 50,000 idle auto jobs just in these specialized EV manufacturing niches nationwide because the skills aren't available domestically. And it contributes to worsening EV price inflation maybe by an estimated 2% because production gets delayed or becomes less efficient. So while the enforcement focus might be politically popular with some, certain polls apparently showed 65% approval for these specific tactics, it simultaneously creates an environment that actively deters the critical foreign direct investment, the FDI, that the U.S. needs for long-term competitiveness in these advanced sectors.
Michelle LaPointe from the American Immigration Council, she criticized these tactics pretty harshly, didn't she? Calling them political theater that misses the core issue entirely.
Yes. Her argument is essentially that these raids are designed more for public spectacle, for demonstrating toughness, rather than for achieving any kind of meaningful systemic reform. She stated that they don't actually fix the underlying problems with the broken immigration system. Instead, they terrorize workers, destabilize communities, and focus on punishing individuals who often pose no public safety threat, all while failing to create the needed, compliant legal pathways that would actually satisfy the legitimate economic demands of companies like Hyundai trying to build things here.
Attorney Chris Ingram, according to our research, actually offered a very specific, humane alternative to how that Hyundai situation could have been handled. An approach that demonstrates how enforcement could potentially achieve compliance with more dignity.
He did. His suggestion was really rooted in fostering, not frustrating, economic progress. Instead of a highly disruptive, militarized-style raid, he proposed that a better approach would have been, first, to conduct a formal audit of the employee's documents at the plant.
Okay, an audit first.
Right. If non-compliance was found, maybe visa issues, paperwork errors, whatever, the workers could then be allowed a reasonable grace period, say 30 to 90 days, to work with the company and immigration authorities to resolve those paperwork issues. If after that period compliance still wasn't achieved, then the instruction could be given for those specific non-compliant workers to return voluntarily to their home country. Critically, without the need for immediate mass arrests, detentions, and the resulting chaos.
And why would that kind of respectful, phased approach be better? Especially for a company like Hyundai that's supposedly creating 9,000 long-term U.S. jobs with this plant.
Because, as Chris pointed out, you're dealing largely with highly skilled, educated individuals here. People who have already demonstrated some commitment to legal compliance just by going through the complex visa application process in the first place. The likelihood is high that most would comply voluntarily with instructions to fix their status or depart, simply to protect their professional standing and their future ability to legally enter the U.S. or other countries.
Makes sense.
This approach, it demonstrates a commitment to due process, it respects the individuals involved, and crucially, it helps build positive international relations and reassures foreign investors. Instead of crippling a major U.S. investment project through fear, detention, and disruption, it represents, he argued, a policy framework that tries to balance the legitimate need for rule of law with the equally important necessity of economic intelligence and stability.
Okay. So let's try to tie these four really powerful, often contradictory threads together now. We've got the individual triumphs, like the Salsa Queen. We've got the staggering 2 million removals milestone. We have the Supreme Court expanding enforcement discretion in L.A., and then the clear economic damage and diplomatic fallout from the Hyundai raid.
Yeah, this deep dive, it truly reveals the heart of this constant oscillation, this back and forth in U.S. immigration policy, doesn't it? On one side, you absolutely have the iron fist of enforcement, represented starkly by those 2 million removals, the SCOTUS-approved patrols, the disruptive factory raids. That seems to be the political imperative driving things. Right. But then, on the other side, you have what you called the forge of unyielding hope. embodied perfectly by Mahara Zapata's incredible entrepreneurial success, and underpinned by the undeniable economic reality that immigrants contribute $1.3 trillion to our GDP. That's the economic imperative. And they're often in direct conflict.
And the data we looked at suggests the public, the electorate, might be reaching a point of maybe bipartisan fatigue with just pure conflict on this issue.
I think so. The public opinion data seems to confirm that thirst for a real workable solution. While yes, a majority acknowledge the border situation is a crisis, 55% see it that way, the fact that 60% and even larger majorities still favor pathways for skilled workers. That tells you something. It suggests the American public recognizes, maybe intuitively, that enforcement alone is an incomplete strategy, maybe even an economically damaging one. They seem to want pathways that are functional, that address our critical labor shortages alongside border security.
The resilience shown by immigrants themselves, just facing these constant challenges, whether it's navigating the fear of detention, dealing with family separations, surviving raids, it's really remarkable.
It is absolutely a core feature of the immigrant experience globally, and certainly in the U.S. They face things like revoked reprieves that might override previous court reliefs, heartbreaking family separations, this constant underlying fear of detention. Yet somehow, their resilience, their drive, it leads to that massive economic contribution we keep mentioning. The core lesson, I think, drawn from all of our legal research here today is that policies really must evolve. They need to prioritize dignity and recognize contributions rather than relying solely on blanket enforcement that actively disregards community stability and, as we've seen, incurs these massive, arguably self-inflicted economic costs.
In that enduring spirit, it feels like it's captured really beautifully in that closing reflection our team found from attorney Chris Ingram. He offers a powerful perspective on the maybe hidden hopes within this whole often negative debate.
He does. He notes that, quote, no matter what, immigrants will find a way to make their own American dream. Despite the political rhetoric, Americans are remarkable people, kind, supportive, and always ready to lend a helping hand to those in need.
And he goes on to argue that, quote, what we see and hear on the news does not accurately reflect America and its people, not even close, so we have to find ways to let people know that. That sentiment, I think, provides such a crucial counterpoint to the often harsh political headlines. It suggests that the daily reality for many people involves compassion and opportunity maybe prevailing over conflict more often than we realize.
Which brings us, I think, to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to perhaps mull over after this discussion. Given the hard economic data we've discussed, the 1.8 million unfilled jobs, the projected 0.3% GDP risk from those shortages, and given the specific legal pathways that do exist and work demonstrated by the Salsa Queen, that successful path from a documented overstay to actual naturalization, how should policymakers fundamentally reconcile the urgent economic need for labor with the equally pervasive political demand for enforcement? How do you do both without incurring those massive, long-term $900 billion fiscal costs and the projected 1.5% GDP losses that come from large-scale labor attrition? That really seems to be the central policy challenge, doesn't it? The one that could determine future American prosperity. Thank you so much for being with us today. We hope you gained a lot from this discussion. Please leave us a comment if you can. Additionally, you can support our channel by sharing it with your friends and family, helping us build this community together. Also, follow us on Spotify, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, and Instagram, where we're growing rapidly thanks to our social media team. We would also like to thank attorney Chris Ingram and his dedicated team once again for researching and preparing this material for our presentation. If you, a friend, or a family member would like a free consultation, you can visit our website at www.breakthroughusa.com and schedule an appointment. We'd love to hear from you and help you if we can.